right, well, we are going to kick off our day today with a wonderful keynote from Jeff Speck from Jeff Speck and Associates. Jeff is a city planner and author who advocates internationally for more walkable cities. As the Director of Design and the U.S. National Endowment for the Arts from 2003 and 2007, he presided over the Mayor's Institute on City Design and created the Governor's Institute on Community Design. So a lot of expertise there. Prior to his federal appointment, Mr. Speck spent 10 years as Director of Town Planning at DPZ and Company, and the principal firm behind the new urbanism movement. Since 2007, he has led Speck and Associates, a private design consultancy. Mr. Speck is the co-author of Suburban Nation, which the Wall Street Journal calls the Urbanist Bible. His more recent book, Walkable City, was the best-selling city planning title in the past decade. Its sequel, Walkable City Rules, is described by Kurt Anderson as a must-read for urban city builders and anyone who lives in cities. Jeff, we're very excited to have you here. The virtual floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Wonderful, thank you. Heidi, for that lovely introduction, and thanks to the folks in Utah for inviting me to speak today. You're just waking up, perhaps. It's 10 o'clock here, so I've had a couple cups of coffee, and I have limited time, so that coffee will hopefully allow me to share what I want to share with you in the time allotted. I had 350 slides. I cut it down to 250, which I can usually do in about 50 minutes, so we'll see what happens. I'm going to share my screen and maximize my PowerPoint. And here we are. So enter a show mode. Tell me, Heidi, if that doesn't look good. It works for me.
Excellent. We can see everything. Thank you.
I believe you guys chose this title, which I embraced and feel is appropriate to what I'm going to be talking about today. I couldn't help notice the instructions implicit within the title. So let's move and start this presentation. I know Salt Lake, the Salt Lake region pretty well. I know Utah fairly well, but not all that well. But I've been to Utah and Salt Lake probably a dozen times in the last 20 years. A lot of time in downtown, taking advantage of your flags to cross the street with my family. A lot of time in Park City. I really enjoy skiing, and skiing there is the best skiing I've done. And then, of course, traveling to the many wonders and beautiful landscapes in the state. Most of what I'm going to be talking to you about today is from the book that gets me most of my lecture invitations, which is Walkable City, and I'll be talking about that. But I wanted to step back a little bit to the one of the themes that we covered in Suburban Nation. That's a little bit counter to the thinking of this conference. And I love the opportunity, I relish the opportunity to talk to DOTs. I gave a talk to the Massachusetts DOT a few months ago. I gave a talk probably 20 years ago to the Texas DOT, which they found really amusing. But I have to say, in those 20 years, the attitude of planners, certainly the attitude of transportation officials and of cities, has really changed a lot. And I've found that the message I have to share is much more embraced, even at DOTs, than it used to be. This one aspect is kind of interesting because it takes the pressure off of you all. And it's something I learned from my mentors, Andres Dwani and Elizabeth Plater-Zyberg. They essentially founded the New Urbanism movement, and I was with them for 10 years, and I wrote this book with them. And one of the things we do in our work as planners is to argue for less mobility. And what I mean by that is needing less mobility, because the best mobility plan is actually a land use plan that requires people to travel between things less. And that's been the fundamental message of the New Urbanism, which I want to share quickly with you today, which is the story of planning, the profession of planning, that back in the 19th century, people were choking on the soot from the dark satanic mills, and the planners said, hey, let's move the housing away from the factories. And when they did, lifespans increased immediately and dramatically. And we like to say that the planners were hailed as heroes, and they've been trying to repeat that experience ever since. So the separation of the landscape into large areas of single use where you have to drive to get from one thing to another because they're so far away, and uses aren't able to mix, unlike in our historic cities. And the most walkable places, of course, are where we have either land plans in place or the absence of land plans that allow us to mix all of our uses together. This leads me to share the fundamental new urbanist argument, which is that there is only two time-tested ways to build community. There's 1,000 ways to make a city, but the only two that we've tested by the thousands are the traditional neighborhood and suburban sprawl. The traditional neighborhood is defined as being compact, diverse, and walkable. Suburban sprawl is the opposite, right? It spreads out. You have one use over many square miles often. And it's not walkable because so few streets actually go anywhere that those few streets that do go somewhere have to handle all the traffic of a city and end up being what we call traffic sewers because they're designed around that sole purpose. And it's fun to break sprawl down into its constituent parts, the places where you only live, where you only work, where you only shop. Our schools get bigger and bigger and therefore further and further apart, and the parking lot tells you how people get to this school. Even our ball fields get consolidated so that the child who lives literally 100 feet, in this case, 100 feet from the sports complex, has an actual 1.5 mile drive to get there. And parents will not let their kids bike on this street. So if you disconnect everything from everything else, the only way that you can reconnect it is with automotive infrastructure in this sprawl model, right? The sprawl model presumes everyone's driving everyone else everywhere all the time, or themselves most likely. And I always tell people, it's a two-part dream. You can have this, and a certain number of Americans want this, although in polls, the majority would rather be able to walk to stuff. But if this is your dream, you have to understand it comes with this nightmare, and you can't have one without the other. Often to absurd extremes, the amount of infrastructure we build to satisfy the need to drive, the frustration being in that environment, of course, can be tremendous. And this is not Photoshop. Being a driver can be a real drag, and being a pedestrian in the resulting environment can be even worse when high-speed roads are allowed to integrate into our communities. This is a picture I'll be showing again, but I got this from some epidemiologists who remind us that the reason we have the first generation of Americans, they tell us the reason we have the first generation of Americans who are expected to have shorter lives than their parents is because we've engineered out of existence the useful walk. And the more you rely on cars, the heavier you're going to be, and we've done this to ourselves. So I want to end this segment with these two images, which remind us that sprawl and the traditional neighborhood are really, they have the same stuff in them. It's just a question of how big is that stuff? How is that stuff distributed? And is there a dendritic branching suburban street network, or is there a porous capillary urban street network that will determine people's quality of life in those two spaces? And we work to create spaces like the ones on the right and try to stop people from building places like the ones on the left. And we're making progress, but I have to say most of what's built in America is still the suburban sprawl model. And that really puts the burden on you all to move people around. Of course, there's some great examples, even in Utah. I think Daybreak is imperfect, but it's a wonderful example of what happens when a new urban thought process is brought to the valley. You have mixed use, you have a downtown core that's commercial, you have schools that everyone around them can and do walk to. And you can see it kind of on the left in the top of this image. Of course, it's in a larger landscape, which has been laid out in the conventional way with a large, you can see the Chick-fil-A and the multiplex theaters, large hunks of just retail, and then uniform clusters of housing all around it. And the retail in Daybreak struggles because so much retail is still located out on the busy roads. This is not at Daybreak, but not too far away, where my sister-in-law lived, and my in-laws, I should say, still live in West Jordan. But she sent me this picture of the 7-Eleven across the street from the 7-Eleven. And when everyone's spending their time in the public realm, then that's how retail responds, and that's the kind of city that you get. But let's move on to the concepts that I bring up in my book, Walkable City. And the book is really about two things. It's about why America needs to be more walkable, and it's about how America can be more walkable. I'm going to talk about both those things today. In terms of why walkable, I have three main chapters that I address to this topic, and three main ways that for many years we were thinking about why walkability is so important. And these are reasons that actually we got from other disciplines. The economists, the environmentalists, and the epidemiologists. We were kind of shouting into the wilderness for a couple decades about why places needed to be more walkable, but we didn't have the data, and frankly, people don't really listen to planners the way they listen to economists and environmentalists and epidemiologists. So we've adopted these arguments as our own, and what I'm going to share with you is stuff that we didn't come up with. It's just what we hear from other professions. In terms of economics, it won't surprise you to hear that driving is just the most expensive way to get around. It's very interesting to note that between 1970 and 2010, in 1970, the typical American spent 10% of their income on transportation. Between 1970 and 2010, we doubled the number of roads in this country, roughly, in the US. And now what we achieved was in 2010, we now spend 20% of our income on transportation, because we've pulled things further apart from each other and we need to move more, but also because we've embraced the most expensive way to move ourselves around. If you're working class in America, you spend as much on transportation as you do on housing, according to the federal government. If you're poor, you spend about 40% of your income on transportation on average. This is a burden on the individual. There's also the burden on society, and you can calculate this a bunch of different ways. The ways I've seen seem to average out at this infographic that I've found that describes the hidden costs, the cost that society as a whole needs to pay when people get around different ways. So if walking costs you $1, society pays a penny. I'm not sure what that is. It's probably sidewalks. Society pays 8 cents for, and I'm not sure how walking can cost you $1, actually. Maybe that's your sneakers. If biking costs you $1, society pays 8 cents. And if busing costs you $1, society pays $1.50. But if driving costs you $1, society pays $9.20. And that's obviously an estimate. It could be off by a bit. But even if it's off by a factor of 10, it's a lot more cost than society is paying for other things. What is that cost? Well, a lot of it's simply the infrastructure. I did want to bring something up. This will be the least welcome part of my talk, but when I speak to DOTs, I can't neglect to bring up the cost of highways, and specifically as it relates to induced demand. This is the Katy Freeway in Texas. It, for a brief moment, was the widest road in the world. They had congestion, so they spent $2.8 billion to widen it to solve that congestion. And they specifically said, we're spending that money so that it's not so congested. Within a couple of years of the widening, the morning commutes were taking 30% longer than before the effort, and the evening commutes were taking 55% longer than before they spent all that money. So there may be reasons to widen a highway, but congestion isn't one of them. Induced demand is well proved. It's not disputed by people who have the data. I think you understand the concept. Traffic planning in theory tells you that if you have congestion, which is the difference between the travel and the capacity, then you can improve the capacity and therefore eliminate the congestion by absorbing it in more lanes. Unfortunately, people's behavior is not constant, and people's behavior responds to the environment. And what the environment tells them is, hey, I can move further away from my office. I can stop carpooling. I can stop taking transit. People make all sorts of decisions. And particularly new development occurs that absorb that traffic absorb that capacity very quickly with new trips. Here's the seminal study that was presented at the Paris School of Economics. Maybe some of you on this call know what this means. I don't know what this means, but I know what the conclusion was. And that was that within 4 years, typically, it ranges, but within 4 years, 100% of that new capacity is absorbed with new traffic. The choice isn't whether you're going to have congestion or not in congested systems. The choice is not whether you're going to have traffic or not. The choice is whether you spend 22 billion more or not on your roads in order to have more lanes of congestion. So it's a question of how you want to grow. The operative sentence is that in congested systems, the principal constraint to driving is congestion. And because congestion is really the only way that we pay the true costs, right? That $9.20, we're paying it, but we're paying it in frustration and time wasted. And because of that, congestion is an equilibrium that we've chosen. So when you're out on the Bangerter and this is your experience, you need to understand this is an equilibrium that people accept, right? This is the amount of traffic that they're willing to deal with day by day. And that means if you give them more lanes, you will have more driving. And the question is, how can we improve mobility in ways that will actually not just last 4 years, but will be more permanent? And that's an economic conversation we could have all day. But let's move on to climate. It's fascinating how, I've observed in my 58 years, the argument around environmentalism has changed very much. But typically, for most of my life, it was cities bad, countryside good, right? Cities is where the pollution is coming from. And that's true because that's where the people are. This is a map of carbon footprints across the US. It's focused on the cities, kind of matches the night sky photographs of those cities. And when carbon footprint entered the argument, it was more evidence that cities were bad until someone started to ask the question, what if we don't, is it right to map carbon per mile? Because what we did was we mapped carbon per square mile across the country. And that clearly said here in Chicago, for example, I'm in Boston, but here in this image of Chicago, cities are producing the most carbon. But what instead if we map it not per mile, but per household? And if you do that, the map just exactly flips. And that's the way we should map carbon, because we can choose where we live in more urban or more rural places. When you have a walkable street network, when you have biking, when you have transit, people's carbon footprint is much lighter. So clearly, if you care about our impact on climate, you want people to live in more dense, walkable communities. And then finally, health. I talked about the epidemiologists who I met. I like to say the best day in America to be an urban planner was when this book came out on August 7th, 2004. And these planners basically said, these epidemiologists basically said, look, it's urban design that's the problem. Urban design is the reason why fully a third of the kids born after 2000 are expected to get diabetes. Diet matters, but city planning matters. It's not the weight itself that's necessarily the problem, but all the maladies that come from the weight. And this image I showed before that I got from the guy at the top, Howard Frumpkin, that he's been showing now in communities for 25 years. The fact that you drive to park, to take the escalator, to the gym, to get on the treadmill, to walk, is the reason the epidemiologists cite that we don't have a healthy society. So that's really important. You notice as you're walking, cycling, and taking public transit increases country to country, your obesity rate decreases rapidly. And interestingly, once you get to a certain point, it's interesting. Well, actually, I don't have time to explain how this works exactly, but you get the general picture of the reversal of the trends. Car crashes. This man's being interviewed right after a car crash by the news media. Often not considered as a health concern, but actually dying is really bad for your health. And of course, the number of injuries, the 2 million permanent, 2 million. It's 40,000 deaths a year in the US from car crashes. It's 2 million permanent injuries a year from car crashes in the US. Those are bad for your health as well. We really are an outlier among the civilized, wealthy countries when it comes to the number of car crash deaths that we have every year. It's a function of two things. It's a function of how much we drive, and we drive more, and it's a function of how fast we drive, how much of that driving is happening on highways, how many streets are engineered to move cars quickly versus more slowly. And that's a big factor if you look at different cities across the US. So car crash deaths per year per 100,000, New York is down around 4, San Francisco is down around 4. Dallas, a more modern city with wider streets and more highways, is around 9.8. Orlando, where just last week I was doing a downtown master plan where we're going to change all their streets if we can. in their downtown, 19.4. Interestingly, Salt Lake City, and this is done by urban areas, it's not done by state, although I have other data on that. Salt Lake is about average, and Utah is about average as a state as well, which is a little bit strange because your roads, you have more newer roads and people drive there more than many places. And it tends to track with how much driving people are doing. There's an interesting factor in Salt Lake that explains it. And of course, white here is less than dark, at least in terms of self-reporting. And for reasons I think you can fully understand, there's a ton less drunk driving in Utah than any other state, which is why as of 2018, when this was done, you are the least drunk driving state in the nation. And that has a tremendous impact on the deaths on your roads. For that reason, you're doing better than you otherwise would, because you do have a lot of highway miles and people do drive a lot in Utah. And of course, you're part of a country in which people are driving much more than in other places. This is one thing, and I have to say the death rate in vehicles, while it's bad in the US, it's kind of leveled off, with the exception of the pandemic, when as traffic reduced, car crashes went up because there was less constriction to speeding. But generally speaking, the US has been doing as well as any country relatively in terms of making it safer to be a driver. Where we're really failing is the experience of being a pedestrian in the US. You notice the rest of the world is tracking downward consistently, while the US pedestrian death rate is going up, and going up dramatically. And this stops in 2018. It is shot even higher. And the scary data is that it's now 50% more deadly to be a pedestrian than it was a decade ago, fully 50%. And we can get into the reasons why. There's two of them. A little bit it's because, or maybe a lot, because poor Americans now live in sprawl. The sprawl, the auto-oriented suburbs have become inhabited by people who don't have cars, and they're getting picked off at an astonishing rate. But actually, the biggest impact is the size of our vehicles and SUVs. The higher hood, the greater mass, the less ability to stop, the huge blind spots, particularly below the hood in front of you, that SUVs have led to this incredible change. And there's not much you can do about it without regulating the design of vehicles, as they're doing in Europe, where they do pedestrian safety crash tests, and they do not do in America. We'd like to see that change. But in the meantime, we can design streets to get people to drive a bit slower. And by the way, in Utah, you're not doing that badly. You're kind of in the middle. I would again say that that's a function of the fact that so few of you drink, but that's where you are nationally. It's amazing how a little bit of investment can change this. This is what they called the Boulevard of Death in New York City, Queens Boulevard. It had 186 deaths over 24 years, and people fought to change the design of the road, and they finally did. After so many years, the design of the road was changed. Each death is, according to the New York DOT at least, is worth almost $2 million. It was calmed in 2014, and there have been no deaths since. The cost of that calming was $4 million, right? So 2-point-something deaths. That's a ratio of 437 to 1 in terms of the cost of the, I'm sorry, I did this wrong. The DOT value of all these deaths cumulatively, 186 deaths, is 1.75 billion. So you can do the math, but that's a multiple of the death per person. But you can see the difference, and how a little bit of change would have saved so much time and so much money, I have to tell you, because there were a lot of payouts from the city associated with all those deaths. And then finally, in the health category, you have asthma, which remarkably in the US is 3 times what it was when I was a kid. It's principally from automotive exhaust. You have an additional factor of being in this valley. You know that air quality is one of your biggest challenges. And you know that one of the largest, not the largest, but I believe the second largest point source of pollution is tailpipes. So of course, anything we can do to get people to make a choice to not drive is going to make your air quality better. So that's it. But actually, after I wrote Suburban Nation, after I wrote Walkable City, it came into my attention that there were two other categories that really needed addressing. I addressed those in my new book, Walkable City Rules, that I recommend for you. It's really geared towards professionals like you all. One of them is equity. And it's remarkable how not only do more people who are poor bike and walk than people who are wealthy. So when you make an investment in biking or walking, you are investing in them. And I should say not just walking, but the biking surprises people that fully 38.5% of the people who are bike commuters are from the poorest 25% of Americans. So again, investments in walking and biking benefit the people who need it the most. But additionally, as covered in this wonderful new book, Right of Way by Angie Schmidt, the number of people who are killed in traffic are as cyclists and particularly as pedestrians are disproportionately people of color, are disproportionately poor, are disproportionately elderly. So if you care about equity, you need to make our streets safer. And then finally, the issue of community and how community is shaped around the streets that of course are our public spaces. Wonderful studies done back in the 1980s by Donald Appleyard indicating, this is a heavy traffic street, this is a light traffic street. How many neighbors people know, how much they walk around, how many friends they have. And I'll do a 10-second reading from my book, Walkable City Rules. Appleyard found that most people living on light traffic streets considered their entire street to be their home territory, while most people on heavy traffic streets only felt at home within their own buildings or apartments. More remarkably, while people on light traveled streets counted an average of 3.0 friends, people on busy streets averaged only 0.9 friends. That's hardly the best ad copy. Heavy traffic for those times when you want to have slightly less than one friend. So that's why to be walkable. I want to get now into the meat of most talks that I have in my remaining 20 minutes or so, how to be walkable. Normally I talk about the useful walk. Basically, for people to make the choice to walk, the walk has to be useful, it has to be safe, it has to be comfortable, and it has to be interesting. I'm going to talk very briefly about the useful walk and spend most of my time on the safe walk, not cover the others due to the subject matter today. The useful walk, I've already covered how we can have the things that we want within walking distance. But the question is, which city are you going to build? Because the way you design your cities actually determines the way that we live our lives. As Fred Kent says, if you plan cities for cars and traffic, you get cars and traffic. If you plan for people and places, you get people and places. And there's this self-fulfilling prophecy where the first thing we do when we plan a community is count the households, count the businesses, do some calculations and say we need to have this many lanes because we're going to presume that everyone's going to drive everywhere. And of course, that creates an environment in which everyone must drive everywhere. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy that we need to short circuit. So good planning 101, of course, you learn this in planning school. The first thing you learn is rail to density and density at rail. You're already doing that a fair amount particularly in Salt Lake City, but you've got both the front runner and the track system. Wonderful thing that many cities like you don't have, to be like Salt Lake City, I should say, don't have. I realize this is a statewide conversation. You're doing really well on the DOT, the development-oriented transit. You're still catching up on the TOD, the transit-oriented development, in the sense that, well, actually, you guys did the right thing, which was to zone high density around these transit stops. Not many of these yet, in my last visit, which was this summer, are very large or contain very much of what would cause people to walk, which is a street lined on both sides with buildings that give it space that's comfortable and interesting. In this whole development, there's only 100 feet of good street. That's actually, now I suspect from this image, it's going to grow into something better and bigger, but it's important that these developments be large and be uniformly walkable. And I'm going to talk about this project as I finish my talk, but this is a TOD we're designing down in Vineyard that's very large and designed to be eminently walkable. Let's get into the safe walk, which is where we should be spending most of our time. In areas in which you want people to walk, this is the most important diagram. Understanding that a car going 35 miles an hour is actually 7 times as likely to kill someone as a car going 25 miles an hour. And that in areas in which people are walking, people are generally driving between 20 and 40 miles an hour. Anything we can do to the environment that causes people to be closer to 20 or even 15 miles an hour is going to save lives. And so how can we shape the environment in ways that people will drive more slowly? The first one is block size. This is Portland, famously walkable, famously 200-foot blocks. I'm sorry to say, around the world, I show this image as a contrast. This is Salt Lake City, not known for being walkable, famously 600-foot blocks. Here they are side by side. It's really quite remarkable. And here's the experience, as I've already described to you. This is a study that was done of 24 different cities and towns in California. And you'll notice that as the average block size doubles, the number of fatal crashes not on highways almost quadruples. And that's a clear correlation. The bigger your blocks, the more deaths in the streets. Small blocks are essential. And the best places to walk in Salt. Oh, and I want to say, these blocks are big. You can fit this much of Rome into one Salt Lake City block. And it's the places where the blocks have started to get broken up, either by smaller streets or by pedestrian ways, where you have more walkability introduced into a city with big blocks like Salt Lake. And most of your cities have big blocks, as you know. The next issue is the number of lanes. Do you have more lanes than you need? More lanes makes it more like a highway. More lanes makes it easier to cross. Harder to cross. Much longer time to cross this street than a narrower street. This is Oklahoma City, where it was named the least walkable city in the entire country, the worst city for pedestrians in the entire country. And the mayor called me in, and I did an analysis of the amount of traffic in each street and the width of each street, knowing that 2 lanes can handle 10,000 cars per day, and discovering these 6,000, 5,000, 3,000 car streets that were 4 lanes or more, and had these very low traffic counts on them. So we did an inventory, and we right-sized the number of lanes to the number of cars that were actually using them. We redesigned 40 blocks of the downtown core, which they slowly rebuilt. It's now pretty much done. My job was the curb to curb of every street. And here's one 4-laner that becomes a 2-laner. Here it is under construction. This street, also the biggest arterial through the downtown, was narrowed. Bike lanes, of course, were introduced. I doubled the amount of on-street parking. I introduced a bike network where there was none. This is a widely heralded example of how a city can become more humane and more successful by making its downtown core more walkable. And they've been celebrating this ever since. The next issue is the width of the lanes themselves. Andres Duany used to joke that the typical street to the typical subdivision is wide enough to allow you to observe the curvature of the earth. And it's true because of the way the standards have changed from 1960 to 1980, for example. These 2 subdivisions, look at the size of the roads, same height of airplane. And we know that people drive faster on wider lanes. So how wide are your lanes? How wide are your urban lanes? If your urban lanes are 12 feet wide, there's 10 times the impacts from accidents as if they're 10 feet wide. And thankfully, we now have this alternative to AASHTO. By the way, AASHTO, which is highway in its name, is the manual that people for decades have been designing cities with. Well, cities should not have highways in them. Cities should have streets in them, which is why the alternative to AASHTO, which has been embraced now by many states and cities, is NACTO. And NACTO comes right forward and says a 10-foot lane is the proper width, not an 11-foot lane unless you've got a lot of buses, certainly not a 12-foot lane or a 13-foot lane. Next is the idea, of course, of pedestrian protection. What's happening at the curb? Parallel parking is, in many cities, an essential barrier of steel that protects the curb from moving vehicles. It makes the sidewalk habitable. This is happy hour in Fort Lauderdale. You'll notice you're allowed to park on one side of the street and not the other side of the street. This is before my walkability study, which put the parking back on this side of the street. This is happy hour on the parked side of the street. This is happy hour on the unparked side of the street, because no one wants to sit against these cars moving very quickly. No one wants to walk on these edges either. So that edge is so important. The other part of this picture, street trees can be essential, especially if you don't have parallel parking. Something's got to protect the sidewalk from the guy who's leaving the street. And street trees, of course, do that. Bike lanes, we're going to talk a lot about bikes today. I'm going to spend most of my remaining time on bikes. The standards have changed. We're getting closer and closer in the US to the model that's proliferated in Europe, which is protecting cyclists from moving vehicles. If a street has more than one lane in any given direction, probably cyclists are not going to feel safe unless they're protected. Here, the parked cars in Pittsburgh have been moved off the curb, door zone buffer, and a cycle track. Here's one in Salt Lake City. No real protection except for this thin edge, but that is something that counts. And of course, if you have more of these all over, you'll start to have a network. Once you have a connective network that actually gets people everywhere, then you'll see your cycling numbers go up. Here is one in New York City, Prospect Park West, that Bloomberg's Commissioner Jeanette Sadiq-Khan put in. You'll notice that we lost a lane, but somehow, even with all of these improvements, the number of cars that get through the street are not reduced. And that often happens because you have a condition where people are essentially speeding from red light to red light, and this just calms the traffic and makes it more efficient. This being New York, there was a drawn out 5-year lawsuit. Eventually, the bike-hating NIMBY trolls grudgingly surrendered to reality. But I show this image to just remind people the difference between a protected lane and an unprotected lane. Nobody really wants their daughter in the door zone. And this qualifies as a complete street, probably according to the standards that you were using in Utah. It is not a complete street because this is untenable as a choice. The other problem with integrated lanes is that there's always stuff in them. And if you protect them properly, people can't put stuff in them, whether it be trash barrels, the Uber that pulls over in front of you, or God knows what people are putting in the bike lane. But it is something that doesn't happen if bike lanes are properly protected. And of course, the latest, greatest solution for intersections protects them as well. This is the European model, which we are now using in Newton, Massachusetts, and Somerville and Cambridge, Massachusetts. The bike lane is now out of the road entirely. When you're building new streets, this is the proper solution, to have the bike lane up on the curb and not in the street. And can we not please do any more sharrows? The data is very clear that sharrows actually make streets more dangerous than not having them at all. I can't get into why. I asked my Twitter base to give me a new sharrow symbol that would properly reflect the way that sharrows work. And one person came up with this, but the winner was the Prero from Queen Anne Greenways. Please just don't hit me while I'm trying to bike in the street that is actually not safe for me to bike in. This is a wonderful model pioneered, I think, by a DOT in Maine for country roads. And what it does is it takes a road which is probably 25 feet wide and forces the traffic into the middle. And of course, when another car is coming at you, you peel off into the bike lane, making sure that no one is in it. But for most of the time, you're staying in the center. So inadvertently, if there is a bicyclist or a walker on your country road, you're much less likely to hit them. I hope that if it hasn't happened already, I hope that UDOT will investigate this solution for country roads that are 25 or so, 30 feet wide. And then there's the mythology around bicycling that comes up at all the public meetings. We all know this woman. It's not actually Kathy who said these things. I want to protect. I should probably put a black strip over her eyes. I don't know who this person is. She represents the person we meet at our community meetings who ask questions like, and I have heard all of these questions, what about the folks from the city taking the bike path to steal my TV? And we respond, in Boulder, Colorado, properties adjacent to bike paths sell for fully 32% more than similar properties 1,000 yards away. What about all the cyclists killing pedestrians? And this just kills me because, of course, when it bleeds and it's a bicyclist, it leads. And never mind, the 40,000 people being killed in car crashes. If one person is killed by a bike, it rules the news cycle for a week. The fact is, a street with bikes in it is safer for all users. In New York, when streets receive new bike lanes, injuries to pedestrians dropped by an average of 22%. And we get the same data all around the country. So you can remind people, more people have died this year in accidents involving vending machines than the number of pedestrians killed by cyclists. And the last time I checked, that was still true. Shouldn't there be helmet laws to protect cyclists? Good question. Well, actually, in New Zealand, when helmet laws were introduced, the number of cyclists dropped in half and the number of injuries per cyclist doubled. And this is what we see all over the place. The only cities that have failed to have successful, truly, successful bike share programs are in Washington State, where helmet laws used to exist. And they just kill ridership, and they end up killing people because the death rates double when there are fewer bicyclists on the road. But nobody bikes in the winter. Well, welcome to Copenhagen and many other cities, even Minneapolis, where there's a lot of winter biking. This is a map of temperatures across the US, and you can see state to state, Utah's right here, temperatures get colder, but bicycling population is just completely unrelated to the, there's no data in North Dakota. Bicycling population is completely unrelated to the temperature of your state. And it has to do with the number of bike lanes that you create. No one is going to saying you shouldn't build bike lanes because no one's biking is like saying you shouldn't build a bridge because no one is swimming the river. Once you put the bike lanes in, people react. And of course, there is no such thing as bad weather, just bad gear, as they say in Portland. But aren't bike facilities tools of gentrification for the elite? Well, this is the image of the bicyclist most people think of, the mammal, the middle-aged man in Lycra. In fact, as I already showed you statistically, this is much more likely to be the cyclist in your communities. And if you want to benefit people with less income, you will build more bike lanes. But cyclists get in the way of my commute. Well, guess what nation in the world is considered the best place to be a driver? It's the Netherlands, which has the most bike lanes just about of all. According to Waze's driver annoyance index, the happiest drivers are in the country with the most bike lanes, because actually when you provide separated bike infrastructure, drivers have a better time of it. And of course, fewer people need to drive. But we're not the Netherlands. Well, the Netherlands did not used to be the Netherlands. Back in the 70s, the Netherlands looked a lot like the US. They've introduced a lot more transit, a lot more walking. They've transformed their streetscapes to still include cars, but to have cars and bikes and skateboarders and pedestrians in a way that's fundamentally changed their culture and their health statistics. Vision zero in the Netherlands means zero, and many of their cities have achieved zero deaths, zero pedestrian deaths. So I'm pretty much done. I did want to quickly show you, though, in my remaining time, the one project I'm working on in Salt Lake, in the Salt Lake region right now, which is in Vineyard, one of the fastest growing cities in the world, probably. And it is for a stop on both tracks and the front runner here up against Utah Lake. It's a few hundred acres between the railway and the lake. I've now rotated north to the west because of the shape of this community to be able to show it a little bit better. And when I arrived there about 3 years ago, there was already a plan on the site. And the plan actually had some new urban aspects to it, as in the street grid, but it had other non-new urban aspects that were really profound, like isolating the office in this yellow area away from the train station, which is right here. And then, of course, having clear zones of different densities and I should say different uses that were very separated. And so we came in and we modified the plan to be this drawing, which I'll zoom into in a bit. But you can see a train station here for both tracks and the front runner. You see the principal entry from the Vineyard connector that loops through here in this location. A fair amount of traffic coming in here, 2 lanes in, 2 lanes out, which we quickly redistribute through what I call a square about, and then no lane anywhere in the remainder of the project. No street needs to have more than 1 lane in any given direction. You can see a network of blocks that are actually Utah sized, but every block is broken up into 4 other blocks or a certain number of other blocks with a secondary pedestrian network within it. This is a view from the station. It's very dense, taking advantage of transit and the city of Utah's aspirations for making the most of that transit stop. This is the view west from the transit platform. This is a view of that square about where the cars come in from the south and then have single lane rotation, or sorry, two lane rotation around this public square, but then peel off in one lane configurations. You can see the density there as well. The station is just up this street. This is a view now down the square, about down the promenade that reaches through the project to Lake Utah. You can see it here in the plan, stretching all the way clear through down to a wonderful waterfront. And we're working, I'm showing you this as the roadways are going in. Phase 1 roads are being built. Phase 1 is actually holding off a little bit because we realize that to achieve this density, we need to first get a little more critical mass of buyers. So we're actually going to be starting down in this area, but the roads are going in throughout the development. And just to give you a sense of the detailed design that we do when we do a project like this, zooming in, you can see the train tracks are up here, the square, and then these pedestrian streets that cut through the middles of the blocks, the parking, of course, hidden, the driving streets narrow as well, and the shape of the buildings holding the edges of streets. Pride of place for the meeting house, which is located at a vista termination in front of the mountains. Great care that goes into the urban design of these places that makes them useful, safe, comfortable, and interesting to walk around. And what we hope will be, what we expect will be the largest TOD in Utah, and what we hope will be a model for more and more locations along your rail network. So, and then I just wanted to zoom in for the engineers in the audience and show you just one street that's currently in final engineering, and how we've got the bike lanes out of the road, up on the sidewalk edge, and the streets are narrow, and driving will be nice and slow. So that's just one project. Thank you so much for your attention. And I want to leave you with some resources as I finish up. I do recommend Walkable City if you haven't read it. I agree with what Planning Magazine says about it. This is my new book that's designed for professionals like you, and is much more actionable in terms of page-by-page direction. I have 2 TED Talks that are 15 minutes each if you want to share this information with other people, one on why cities need to be more walkable and another on how to do it. And I teach a class at Harvard every year, 2 days. This year it's the 13th and 14th of June. Maybe some of you can be sent out to join that class. It's not cheap to get to Cambridge, and you have to pay Harvard money to attend this class. But when you're done, you get a diploma that actually makes it look like you graduated from Harvard. And it took me 4 years to do that. So, and then my website, jeffspeck.com, which has all these resources available to you. If you have any more questions, please go there. Thank you so much for your attention. And I have managed to leave 8 minutes for questions and answers. So I'll stop my share and join you as a human.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jeff. That's great. I'll be your moderator for some questions. We have 2 in the chat, but I figured I would start us out with one. So a couple of weeks ago, during the 2022 legislative session here in Utah, they appropriated $40 million to be used for paved pedestrian or paved non-motorized transportation projects. Great. So this really is a historic investment in active transportation. It does require a 20% match, which means that we have $48 million being spent on active transportation projects throughout the state. From your perspective, how should we use this historic investment in walkability and bikeability to build more active, healthy?
So I have a very clear opinion on that. I think that, we need to look first where people are dying. Okay, so if there are certain locations, either urban or suburban, where a lot of pedestrians and cyclists are being picked off, I think the ethical way to use that money is first to do traffic control devices or just redesign of intersections that stops the bloodshed. But that's the emergency. If the real goal is to change people's quality of life and to create the option of walking for more people, that's going to be happening in your existing pre-war town centers, cities and town centers. The only places that have the right bones to become truly walkable, I'm sorry to say, are the places that are either new urban, like Daybreak, or our developments, which are very, very, very few, or those many places, main streets, town centers, and cities that were built up around the proper model of a porous network of many reasonably small blocks. And so what I recommend that those communities do immediately is a lane audit, figuring out how many lanes they have versus how many they really need, and a lane width audit, figuring out what extra asphalt exists in their streets that can be repurposed, and then to redesign those streets around optimizing their use for every mode. And what I've found in almost every city I work in, the majority of which are red cities, is that the business community wants a more multimodal downtown or main street, but they also don't want their driving to be inconvenienced. And I am able to find in all these cities places, as in Oklahoma City, where actually there's more capacity than necessary or more lane width than necessary, and you can create a wonderful, safe environment for pedestrians and cyclists without impeding throughput. I did not talk about signals today. One thing we've done is we change a ton of signals back to always stop signs when we're able to make the streets more delicate. That actually gets people through downtowns faster because you're never sitting at a light. We did it in Albuquerque. And when you change a signal to a stop sign, along the stretch of a road, it's actually a quicker traverse through the downtown and much, much safer.
Excellent. I think we have time for one more question. This is from Gina Espinosa. When Jeff briefly talked about the useful versus safe walks, he mentioned the need to be comfortable and purposeful, and others. Would he repeat those desired conditions for useful and safe sidewalks respectively?
So useful has to do with the mix of uses and handling transit and parking well. Safe has to do with the sort of stuff I talked about and other things I didn't talk about, like stop signs, and there are others. When you remove a center line from a street, people drive 7 miles an hour slower. I mean, there's 100 of them. They're all in my book. Then there's comfortable, and then there's interesting. Comfortable has to do with the shaping of spaces and whether you feel properly enclosed by your streetscape, because remarkably, people aren't comfortable in spaces that bleed. You need to feel like you're in an outdoor living room when you're in a public space, or else generally you're not so comfortable. And trees help a tremendous amount with that as well. And then finally, interesting, when we work in communities, we make sure that buildings don't have blank walls. We make sure that the parking lots are hidden, that the structures have a habitable edge, parking structures have a habitable edge. And we don't let architects repeat the same building over and over and over again, or just create conditions where it's boring to walk, because actually humans will turn around if they're bored. So making truly walkable communities means doing all four of those things at once and finding those places in your communities where that's possible. The majority of the landscape, particularly in Utah, is going to remain drivable, but there are places that can still be drivable while also being super walkable, and identifying those places, starting small with something that's uniformly excellent, is how you create the beginnings and then a larger pedestrian culture.
Wonderful. Well, we're kind of at time. Thank you, Jeff, so much for your wonderful keynote remarks. We're now on our fourth and final giveaway. I do see we have extra questions in the chat. Jeff, if you don't mind, maybe if there's any that are relevant or that you could cite your book quickly. But yes, thank you so much. I think if we were in person, you'd have a big round of applause for your time today.
I'm sorry, I don't have more time. The answers are in my books.
Perfect.
I'm cheating.
Excellent.
Thank you all. Hey, this was, I am sorry I can't see any of you, but I see there are a lot of you, and this was a lot of fun for me. So thank you for the opportunity.
Wonderful. Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.